The causes of war are a bit more complex than fighting over resources. However, insofar as such is a cause of war, a moneyless free labor society neatly eliminates that as a cause. On the one hand, the bioregional constraints of trade ensure that each bioregion is maximally providing for the people living within it. On the other hand, the gift-giving involved with intra-bioregional trade entails no real need to war for resources. In a meaningful sense, the ending of poverty already entails this. Other causes of war are somewhat more obtuse. Degrees of power that people may want, needs for control over others, etc. The proper joint carving along bioregional grounds, and a bit more broadly along ecological grounds, goes a long way towards dealing with this. There are no poor cuts being made, no divisions of lands predicated on the whims of anyone. Just a pretty neutral scientifically and ethically based division of lands along the grounds of the existing ecologies, upon which all the species' activities are predicated. Regardless of what political system is in use within a given bioregion, there are no questionable questions regarding over which lands the political system holds the reins of power. See, however, Minimization of Politics in the Real Benefits section. We may ponder at what mechanisms we may employ to enforce such things, however. This may be among the most questionable questions of all. What to do if someone tries to expand their power through military use implies some greater need for land. Perhaps, after all, the system as such falters. A bioregion is facing severe issues. Other bioregions are for one reason or another unable or unwilling to help, and the solution becomes just to take whatever goods or services are necessary to meet the needs, wants and desires of the people within the bioregion. In that instance, what are we to do? I mean, firstly, this is not meaningfully different from the current situation, so the concern again is not one that provides any good justification for not doing a moneyless free labor society. Still, the situation could arise, and we may ponder at what incentives we would have in place as deterrents or responses. There is the age-old bit regarding mutual pacts to combat that kind of behavior. Force is utilized, that is, war is waged, wherein the massive conglomerate of other bioregions against any single bioregion is so great that no single bioregion really has any incentive to that recourse. I don't think there is anything particularly wrong with that modality of thought. It has done reasonably well in the past and in the current for stamping down violence. But clearly it only goes so far, as it doesn't actually address the underpinning issues that cause war in the first place. The Moneyless Free Labor Society does provide for exactly the addressing of the underpinning issues that cause war in the first place, beyond the raw, rather boring and dumb concerns of politics. Let's examine each of these. The grab for resources. Noted already, but for the sake of completeness, the grab for resources is nullified, at least insofar as is possible within the existing ecosystem. That last caveat is important, less so as a matter of exceptions wherein a bioregion thereby has cause for war, and more so as a reality check on those who would want to go to war. In effect, they are making their situation worse off overall by choosing to war. If, in other words, the system were maximally providing within the actual existing means of production, there is no real incentive to try and grab more. I admit that such will only go so far, and is dependent upon the capacity to actually produce sufficiently for the people within any given and all bioregions. However, I do not see any reason to suggest that such is not plausible. The earth is abundant in its capacity, and the species is clearly capable of massive overproduction at this point. Gift-giving. Simple gift-giving ethics likewise goes a long way towards reducing the impetus to war. Absent any particular motive to not gift-give goods and services between bioregions, beyond the limits noted in the interbioregional trade section, absent more to the point the supposed requirement to receive something in particular in exchange for such gift-giving, beyond, say, the understanding that others will do the same sort of gift-giving, those kinds of causes of war are greatly diminished. Such is strikingly similar to the basic notion that trade rather than wars to grab resources is preferable. This system proposes as an improvement both in that each bioregion minimizes its requirements for trade and eliminates that pesky problem of greed whereby wealthy bioregions are capable of ever greater trade, which creates massive inequalities. In other words, in instances whereby there is some need, want or desire for something, some resource, good or service, the immediate solution is to simply give it to them. There not being any particular reason as to why not entails that there isn't any particular reason to go war over it. At least not on the metric of a want for resources, goods or services. Hatred. Religious strife, racial hatreds, ethnic hatreds, intertribal hatreds, etc. In the currents of the internets, the capacity that people have to understand other cultures, be educated about them in a manner that is not dependent upon existing power structures, etc., all undercut these tendencies. The point that the current global understanding of reality is so vastly different for the overwhelming majority of people than it ever has been at any time in the species' history entails a fairly wildly different reality, especially for folks who have made use of the internets to educate themselves. Hence, after all, we see pretty plainly in all the relevant data that the younger the population, the less these kinds of hatreds of old have really taken hold. It is one thing to hear about some distant lands with strange peoples, wherein such hearing of them is through some tiny lens of view, a rando newspaper article, a bit of government propaganda, or for the real nerdy, taking the time to read some lit on the topic. It is another thing entirely to live with them in a multicultural setting, and another thing still to have access to speaking to these people via the communications networks. The point is that people are far less likely to have these kinds of prejudices against each other when they have at least a basic education as to who these other people are. Again, we already see this in all the relevant data regarding those sorts of hatreds as it relates to younger populations. In pragmatics, though this proposal doesn't necessitate any particular education, beyond a greater tendency towards homeschooling, as a practical output of having more time available within the home for that sort of labor, I would hold that the basic educational model ought to be one that is geared towards global multiculturalism as a reality. I might go so far as to hold that education can go a long way towards calming those kinds of aspects, specifically within a moneyless free labor society in the following sense. Teaching people the reality of a moneyless free labor society from the get-go entails that they are far less likely to actualize those kinds of hatreds. In other words, the system does lend itself to a reducing of those kinds of hatreds, providing of course that one teaches that the reality is bioregionally constrained moneyless free labor societies. In the current wherein competition is beholden as great, the doctrine of scarcity is the norm, etc., we might very well expect exactly those kinds of hatreds to arise. As in, it's that bioregion over there that is to blame, is a kind of norm within the current, due to exactly the belief in scarcity and competition. Within the moneyless free labor society proposed here, however, that kind of justification or understanding of the world is simply neither true nor particularly convincing. When folks are taught the reality wherein the reality is a moneyless free labor society in which gift-giving is an ethical norm, maximal bioregional self-sufficiency is a norm, wherein basic global ecosystem maintenance is a norm of constraint in behavior, fundamentally the students are taught that bioregion over there is doing its part, are generous gift givers, etc. Note of course this dovetails within the currents regarding the global multicultural reality, the basic educational practices of teaching racism bad and different culture good. See also the arguments and points given in the Odd Questions of Privilege, a slight history of colonialism. The drawing of bioregional borders. Although it has an ugly history associated with it, drawing the bioregional borders as the relevant border of economics and politics may go a long way in taming these kinds of hatreds, simply in virtue of settling the issues regarding political borders. That is to say, that the belief that folks could simply redraw the political map to better suit their purposes is effectively removed as an option. Likewise, the tendency for folks to utilize the arbitrariness of political borders as a rationale for hatred goes away, specifically the various versions of nationalities as modalities of hatreds. Hence, the impetus to grab at the power of politics as a solution to the perceived issues involved with these kinds of hatreds simply isn't present. Note this is different than the notion of trying to draw political borders to match up with various ethnic, tribal, nationalistic, or racial groupings. It holds rather bluntly that the division along bioregional grounds is the proper joint carving regarding decision-making processes, and hence there is no plausibility for argument along those grounds. Hence, folks within a given bioregion are interdependent upon each other, with no real recourse to not be beyond moving, though see inter/intrabioregional travel, and they have a whole slew of incentives to work together regardless. The minimization of politics, see relevant section, also provides few avenues for any kind of intra/interbioregional strife. Basic absence of money. This is perhaps too often not really considered, but the greed motivation for money is a primary motivating factor in most wars. Hence, building the treasury up as a basic motivation for war throughout history. Garnering various trinkets and glitteries that are considered monetarily valuable, etc. All these have been real motivators for war and violence. I mean, see colonialism for instance. But similarly, see most of the species' history. Such motivations are utterly void within a moneyless free labor society. Minimization of the strange motives of politics. Greater detail is given in the section Minimization of Politics, but as it relates to war, it is well worth noting that war as a means of garnering political power and clout is a well-known cause of war. There is a real sense in which political leaders well understand that a war provides them with a great deal of power and justification to do the various strange things they want to do. Just the basic bioregional divisions within the moneyless free labor society already largely removes this kind of motivation. The further minimization of politics likewise minimizes these kinds of motivations for war. Worth considering that through the minimization of war, aside from all the avoidance of death and destruction, The minimization of war also greatly reduces the usage of resources and overall does a lot to handle the issues involved with climate change. Specifically, the overuse of fossil fuels, global warming, use of resources beyond their renewal rates in general, reduction in surplus labor, etc. That is, the minimization or elimination of war entails a massive reduction in the usage of these various resources. Similarly, the minimization of war greatly reduces the overall labor in the system. Not just in terms of the soldiers, but the military-industrial complex attached to it. Likewise, such further minimizes the role of politics, as among the major rationales for the existence of political mechanisms is exactly the matters of military concerns. If we may, folks would do well to understand this point as that the issues of political power grabbing are minimized and localized to within a given bioregion, and insofar as political power grabbing is a cause of war, which is no small amount, war itself is thereby minimized. The initial joint carving and the relative stability of the relative borders so drawn provide for a lot of minimization of politics. In essence, much of the political hubbub in the world in the current as well as throughout history has been a matter of drawing imaginary lines on the ground. Out of hypothesis, joint carving the relevant borders along ecological/bioregional lines as a long-term solution eliminates these kinds of issues with politics. More to the point, doing so eliminates that kind of political motivation. Specifically, I am referring to the motivation within politics to have power over some other bioregion, other that is, than the one within which the politician resides. Likewise, it eliminates the political motivation to be seen as doing something, the rhetoricians, the motivational speakers, the political dramarama that comes with politics. How often, after all, has war been the product of a politician needing to be seen and heard as if they were really doing something? The notion here is that local is defined well by the sound joint carving, whereby the proper decision-making grounds, literally and figuratively, are thereby crafted. The proper people to make the decisions for a given bioregion are those within said bioregion. Much of the political strife in the world can be understood as folks from differing political divisions arguing and fighting over capacity to make decisions relative to a given plot of land. The most obvious of these cases regards watersheds. When folks from differing political regions each make decisions regarding the usage of a single watershed, there becomes political strife rather specifically over who actually has the rights to even make decisions about it. The proper bioregional divisions entails that entire category of political strife is simply eliminated. To be clear, there may remain political strife within that boundary. Peoples along a given stretch of waterway may actually disagree about what to do with the waters therein. The eliminated political strife regards the questions of who are the proper peoples to make those decisions, not what those decisions may actually be. Consider the local politician. Their aim largely is to be seen as doing something, as providing for the local community in some fashion. Oft in the current, this entails something akin to bringing home money from the larger piles of money within the larger political bodies of relevance within the region. In a moneyless free labor society, money isn't really the concern, labor is. What is very interesting and frankly odd about the current is that the money so garnered by the local politician is generally primarily used to pay local workers within their respective community to do the labor. Now, I want to point out that that kind of motivation is very performative and pointless within the moneyless free labor society. If the laborers were asked, "Would you do this labor for the community?" the general reply is yes, providing the labor is warranted. Money doesn't really play a meaningful role in the decision to do or not do the labor. The concern for the laborer is far more like, is the labor something that will improve my community? Not to utterly deride the money motivator within the current. Within a moneyed society, the local politician is in fact trying to provide for their community. There isn't necessarily anything particularly nefarious about the local politician's actions. They are simply working within the system as it is. But consider how superfluous that kind of money gathering really is after all. The laborers are willing to do it because they thereby receive the means to live, in the currents that is money. But the laborers are willing to do it because it improves the quality of their lives within the moneyless free labor society. In other words, of course the laborers want to produce the goods and services they are to consume. What is so horrifically odd therefore about the local politician begging for money is that it places the determination to do so or not in the hands of others, specifically government. In all pragmatics it says, you cannot work unless and until the government tells you to work. Money after all doesn't do the labor, people do. All money is doing is signifying if/when the laborer can work. Such isn't or needn't be understood as particularly nefarious on the part of anyone involved. Such can be understood as an inherent part of a moneyed system, a rather serious flaw in which government or, for that matter, industry determines if and when someone ought to work. In either case, government or industry, the issues they face are essentially the same. It supposedly requires money to induce the laborer to work, hence they have to procure money in order to pay the workers. Yet, from the point of view of the laborer, money is rather superfluous to their interests. The laborer is interested in partaking in the goods and services within the community by doing the relevant labor involved in creating them. For the laborer, again, there is no obvious or unobvious reason for money. Money is but a tool, too oft a tool of control utilized exceedingly poorly, but a tool nonetheless. Again, the mere gathering and hoarding of tools is absurd, plausibly insane behavior. Absent money, the local politician has as their concern the relative well-being of the community, something like the smooth functioning of the systems in place. In what may be the worst kind of case within a moneyless society, the local politician simply dictates what labor is done, when, and by whom. This proposal is not the worst-case proposal. The notion of the moneyless free labor society, after all, is that labor choosing what labor they do is already largely sufficient for the determination of what goods and services are provided within the community. I want to strongly suggest as a position for the moneyless free labor societies that the notional role of the politician is to do nothing, or at least to do very little, but to be present and act as needed to check and balance any issues that may arise within a moneyless free labor society. That such ought to be very independent from industry and labor as such. In this understanding of government, the government is best when it is governing least, not because it ought not have power to govern, but rather because its role is to check and balance the other systemizations. If government is acting, it entails that there is something flawed, wrong with the existing systemizations. Again, there is a temptation therein for government, more specifically, for politicians to be seen and heard as if they were actually important, actually doing something. Concerns over government action of that sort are very valid and ought to be watched out for. Ultimately, there is little difference, again, between Big Corp X or Big Gov X making the decisions for people in general. Their motives may vary, and some of the aspects of hiring and firing may differ, but the fundamental issues involved with them making those kinds of decisions for people remain essentially the same. The politician who holds forth the boogie person as the enemy, the other over there as a problem, the bad of some people as the issue that they themselves can deal with, that indeed they and only they can deal with, hence, vote for me, elect me, crown me, etc. These are the kinds of politicians and governmental institutes that small government advocates ought to be concerned with. Not the politician who is acting in good faith to actually be a check and balance upon the non-governmental systemizations. Government ought to have that kind of power. Rather, such advocates ought to be concerned with the politicians who are peacocking it as means of manufacturing problems that they themselves can solve. Again, that government governs best which also is governing least is apt, but not in the sense of lack of power to govern at all, rather, in the sense of not needlessly governing. Granting that a systemization that enables the, shall we say, lazy government official, is better than not in such circumstances. We would want, in other words, a systemization whereby our elected leaders legit get to sit around and do very little, and also feel comfortable enough in doing very little that they don't feel the need to peacock it. Gentler readers ought to understand that as the kind of position Moneyless Free Labor Societies is describing and arguing for. With that in mind, I want to outline areas that seem plausibly applicable for government and hence political relevance. Enforcement of renewal rates. There is a plausible role for the local politician, whereby they are concerned with enforcement of the limits of the bioregional renewal rates. Such provides an additional check upon labor, which may be desirable. It is worth noting, though, that all the incentives of labor are to exactly not exceed the rates of renewal. Labor, after all, doesn't generally seek to overproduce in the first place, as that just means more labor. The plausible point of having government in charge of keeping track of renewal rates and ensuring that business and industry stays within it can be viewed as ensuring that a third party handles the relevant data. After all, as noted elsewhere in this piece, it is plausibly the case that these kinds of concerns are quantifiable and that hence, they can simply be measured and looked up by the relevant business and industries. Still and again, it is possible that there may be instances whereby the renewal rates are being overused, and there is a need for some third party to step in and put a stop to it. Limiting, mitigating, and managing pollution. Pollution from labor is an issue, though labor has its own incentives to not pollute. Namely, the pollution is going exactly where they live, more or less, and moreover, labor is generally exactly utilizing those resources wherein the pollution is occurring. Note that this is markedly different than when the concern is for money, therein as long as money is being made, pollution doesn't matter. That said, I suspect that limiting, mitigating, and managing pollution is likely a significant function of government, because there is also a perverse incentive of labor to let someone else clean it up. That is, even setting aside money as a concern, there remains the very plausible point that labor and businesses in general may tend towards leaving a mess in their wake, unless someone is, with a whip behind them telling them to clean up their shit. Good business practices ought to be taught to keep their business clean, And the bioregional constraints do provide for a far more conscientious set of business practices. They're going to be living where they're working, utilizing those resources, etc. So there is a good incentive to not make a mess of the place. Still, a good laborer has incentives to be lazy too, hence the point of government involvement. Resource use disputes. Handling disputes between labor wherein resources are wanting to be utilized for multiple purposes. Again, the incentives for labor are to exactly not overproduce, so in practice such disputes are very likely rare. In other words, it's a bit hard to swallow that we would come across instances wherein laborers themselves are fighting over exactly who gets to work. In general, such instances wherein scarcity of the resource isn't an issue and necessity of labor isn't an issue, amount to an identification of superfluous labor. In which case labor defaults to less labor. Still, wherein scarcity of a resource is an issue, the local politician may need to step in order to ensure that the resource isn't overused. Likewise, wherein necessity of the labor is an issue, the local politician may need to step in to specify priority of the labor relative to the community. As with other aspects of moneyless free labor societies, the structure of the systemization minimizes the need of government interaction, but doesn't thereby remove government involvement as a principle. Disputes of space use. Public projects, space for local markets, space for local businesses. These all may be relevant for the local politician. There may be relevance to the point of maintaining these kinds of spaces, zoning, directing labor towards their construction, etc. However, labor itself has plenty of incentive to provide for exactly these kinds of things, as already alluded to and detailed throughout this piece. What may remain for the local politician is to provide a venue to direct people to the relevant labor that may need or ought to be done within the community. In other words, if there is labor that needs or ought to be done, the local politician could help make the point. However, it is worth noting that within all existing industries, this is already accomplished within the industry. As with other things, the local politician may serve as little more than a safety net wherein the existing methods and the incentives of labor are insufficient. Moreover, on this point, the existing communications systems provide a rather well-encapsulated methodology of communicating these kinds of concerns, via such things as community messaging boards, organizations that concern themselves with various relevant issues, etc. All already provide the relevant information to the people. People may need to be trained to pay better attention to them. A retool of their thinking from looking to government to solve their problems to looking to the actual needs, wants and desires of the bioregion with themselves as being one aspect of the labor needed to do so, but such is hardly an insurmountable task. See also the relevant discussions regarding open gift-giving markets. Where these kinds of disputes are more plausibly in the realm of government regulation is as regards zoning laws, the broader scalar usages rather than the specific usages within those zones. In other words, it is one thing to wonder at which persons gets to utilize the business space that is suitable for restaurants. It is another thing entirely to determine which areas are appropriate for restaurants at all. The latter is clearly more relevant for government action, whereas the former is a matter of determination via the interested parties, the hands of labor insofar as such is possible, with government stepping in as necessary to resolve disputes that may arise. Dealing with criminal activity. Management of the criminal justice system is something that very likely is the role of the local politician. However, note that the minimization of thievery likewise minimizes this particular aspect of government. Moreover, the minimization of the legal apparatus via the removal of money seriously curtails the relevant role. Most likely there will remain various relevant kinds of criminal activity, but having it be minimized entails a rather modest role for the local politician. Worth noting that without the issues of money, wherein poverty is not a real thing, there may be a reduction in violence. That is something that would remain to be seen, but the connectivity between poverty and crime, beyond theft that is well noted in the relevant lit. Point being that while dealing with criminal activity is a sound role for governing action, a moneyless free labor society plausibly limits that role rather radically so by radically reducing the causes of criminal activity. Mindful small government. Politicians as interbioregional tradespeople. It is plausible that as a matter of interbioregional trade the local politician has some meaningful role to play. Specifically as regards to maintaining within bounds of bioregional renewal rates. This needn't necessarily be the case, but it may actually be more pragmatic. Specifically, it is plausible that relevant local industries can respond to concerns of interbioregional trade or, for that matter, intrabioregional trade, providing of course that they are functionally operating within the relevant bioregional constraints of renewal and the proper ethic of gift-giving. In pragmatics, in other words, wherein the system is already in place, the quantitative measurements of renewal rates, etc., are all well known, and the labor constraints as a matter of practice already provide the proper incentives to not overproduce. Individual local industries can largely make such determinations of trade themselves. Wherein local industries are primarily utilizing local resources, and wherein local industries have control over the determination as to if, when and how local resources are traded intra/interbioregionally, each industry within each bioregion has the capacity to make those kinds of determinations. Hence, again, reducing the role of the local politician perhaps to that of an oversight position, a relatively impartial check. We may also understand such as a methodology for the local community to have a voice in matters regarding industries they are not themselves directly a part of, which provides for the industries an outsider's perspective. A kind of accounting function more than anything else. Critically therein is the point regarding economic imperialism, the fallacy involved in having a bioregion determine the usage of another bioregion's resources. In practice, this may amount to something like free trade within the constraints of primarily producing for within a bioregion, and the constraints associated with overall renewal rates of resources. Such could even be fairly well delineated as plausibly relevant for government action and oversight predicated upon these relevant distinctions. Trade within a bioregion. Intrabioregional trade is unlikely to be of direct relevance to the politician. Largely business is simply a free-form, though see other roles of politicians in this section, and note that a bioregion is generally the size of what this species refers to as a country or nation, so we are not speaking of small areas. Trade with adjacent bioregions. This is a mid-likelihood of direct relevance for a politician. These are the kinds of trades that are broadly enabling cottage industries to exist and provide for their bioregion and all adjacent bioregions, which is in effect their broad mission statement. These we would expect industry and business interests to primarily be the folks making such decisions, with the politicians' role of oversight again mostly being relegated to the other kinds of regulatory and oversight aspects listed in this section. However, because we are speaking of differing bioregions, it is entirely plausible that disputes of an interbioregional sort may arise, whereby by definition neither industry nor business interest is actually qualified or positioned to handle. Hence, there is the plausible role of the politician to handle those kinds of issues. In other words, some kind of third party to adjudicate the issue. It's as regards interbioregional trade that is not with adjacent bioregions that we see the highest likelihood of the politician's role. These sorts of trading endeavors are not obviously regulable to any given industry or business whatsoever, and may, and indeed perhaps oft do, entail the involvement of multiple bioregions, each with differing interests and concerns. The products of these kinds of trades likewise tend to be useful and indeed only really useful via en masse transactions that are intended to produce en masse goods that are plausibly useful for people in all bioregions. See the discussion regarding interbioregional trade. The point here is that these kinds of affairs are not the sorts of things that are neatly contained via the business interests involved, and hence are highly likely to require the involvement of third parties, governing bodies, to regulate their manufacturing and distribution in a fair manner. Within the Moneyless Free Labor Societies, note that each of these tiers are progressively less prioritized. Intrabioregional trade is prioritized over trade with adjacent bioregions, which is prioritized over trade with non-adjacent bioregions. Hence, again, the structural minimization of government within trade. Moreover, I would argue, the appropriate demarcation of government involvement, as the mindless reduction of government involvement is, well, mindless. Another not-so-obvious boon associated with a moneyless free labor society is the increase in the capacity for people in general to express kindness, generosity, love, and helpfulness towards others. It's something of a truism, but still worth noting, that only the wealthy can afford to be generous. In a society whereby an abundance is the norm, and whereby the masses have the time available to freely give, the capacity for people to express such things as kindness, generosity, love and helpfulness towards others radically increases. It ought not be so difficult for the reader to recognize that if they themselves had the time and resources available, would they utilize that to express such things as kindness, generosity, love, and helpfulness? If they had such things, would they work specifically to provide them to others? If they were not operating on a premise of artificial scarcity, if they were within the realm of a superabundance, if they weren't stressed out over making ends meet, if the ends had met, greeted each other, and decided too it was good enough to not stress about such things anymore, would the reader here be in a position to be kind, generous, loving, and helpful to others? It is no coincidence in the current that the wealthy are the suppliers of major foundations devoted to philanthropic activities. Nor is it a coincidence that the elderly constitute a majority of people who do volunteer labor. In either case, we are speaking of people who have their needs, wants and desires largely already met, and hence have the time and resources available to do such things. The point, as somewhat obvious as it is important, for it speaks to the reality of human nature. That when humans are not stressed out, not working to live, when they are granted the time and resources to do so, they will actually tend to do such things as be kind, generous, loving, and helpful to others. Such extends into the familial relations too. When people have the time and aren't stressed out about the resources involved in doing so, they tend to focus on the familial relations. They tend to, in other words, express kindness, love, generosity and so forth to their families, friends, loved ones, etc. Here the rather blunt-tipped point is that when a people en masse are granted that capacity, then they are thereby granted the capacity to do the relevant labors that need and ought to be done to help the less fortunate en masse. To borrow a phrase from the poets, they are thereby granted the capacity for industrial revolution, a revolution predicated upon exactly kindness, generosity, and love. In somewhat more specific terms, when folks are granted those capacities of expression, whereby the superabundance of industrial generosity are available, the issues that face the species are solvable. Would, in other words, an industrially productive society even have to do much labor to provide for the needs, wants and desires of others? For the laborers, wherein the work involved is actually massively less than at any time in the species' history, would they really deny the simple giving of their time that was granted back to them to bring forth that same prosperity in superabundance to others that are less fortunate? If money is no object, and let's be clear, money was never an object but merely a symbol, what prevents people from doing exactly that? With greed removed, with the time and resources freely available to do so? It's difficult in the extreme to see how anyone wouldn't in those set of circumstances. Consider such the industrial mobilization of loves, the capacity to give. Little doubt there is a real concern regarding ensuring that those doing the giving are not giving too much, let's say. But then, this piece is exactly providing a methodology whereby the relevant constraints, modalities of thought, and considerations of the pragmatics involved are outlined to the extent that others can exactly implement such things without overgiving. The efficiency of a system can at least in part be understood as the minimization of waste. In regards to, firstly, foods, the wastefulness in the current within wealthy societies is a well-noted phenomenon. This ought to signify to people that there are a lot of inefficiencies in the system. Consider again the issues facing local producers of goods and services. Costs more than anything else tend to prevent people from utilizing their goods and services. Food grown is put to market where oft enough it simply doesn't sell. The small point that it doesn't sell, contrary to the current modeling, doesn't actually entail that there is necessarily anything inefficient in terms of meeting the actual demands within the locale. Rather, it signals an inefficiency in how the monetary system itself is structured. Specifically, people can't afford to buy the food. It isn't that they don't want to buy the food. In any sane modeling of supply and demand, this ought to be recognized as a rather serious problem. Pointing out all the various problems with smaller producers of foods being muscled out, and so forth doesn't really address the underpinning point. In a moneyless free labor society, the preference is exactly to go to the local food supplier first. In terms of local markets, wherein the foods are given away, in other words distributed, the foods are maximally utilized by people. Anything not utilized locally entails foodstuffs that are surplus, and can go on the surplus market. Not too dissimilar to the current, such likely entails sending such foods to be reused in other kinds of processes of foods, such as frozen foods, animal feed, canned goods, and so forth, which in turn supply longer-term storage of foods, and can potentially be placed on the open gift-giving market. Insofar as those kinds of processes cannot be utilized, as in folks can't even give the stuff away, such signals a surplus of local labor. In the case of foods, again, such entails growing some other crop, for instance if a shortage was noticed in some other crop, or some novel crop ought be grown, or it entails that that field ought not be farmed. It isn't, after all, like the species can't just farm it later if needs be. Since this is applicable to each bioregion, or perhaps more realistically, to each set of adjacent bioregions, each set of bioregions minimizes the waste, and hence becomes more efficient. Insofar as this is practiced overall, the whole system thereby minimizes waste, sourcing out not only surplus labor but also where exactly it is that the surplus foods ought to go. Again, not predicated on the distortions of money, but rather upon the honesty of gift-giving. Such is applicable to all goods and services, but is also explained elsewhere in this piece. Here I think the whole of the matter can be summed up rather neatly via the point that if something can't even be given away, then it is superfluous. This would be true for goods and services of all types. Though there are serious distortions in the current system whereby such surpluses are not really identifiable, as in, there are goods and services that are not utilized but which are not surpluses, even though they are being given away. This because in the current systemization, surpluses are not identifiable in the same kind of way. Something that is being given away may be viewed as something of little worth, little value, because it is being given away rather than having a dollar bill attached to it y'all. Likewise, something may be viewed as surplus in the current because it wasn't sold, even though there is demand for it. Surplus in this piece is at least partially defined as that which is produced beyond the meeting of the needs, wants and desires of a bioregion, set of adjacent bioregions, or any given bioregion, in that order of priority. Its other part of definition lay within the personal, as in, labor. Work that is done that is personally worthwhile is not necessarily surplus labor, as the individual too constitute their own set of needs, wants and desires. Maximally surplus, therefore, are those labors that are not fulfilling to the laborers, that is, that laborers themselves don't even want to do themselves, and which also fail to meet the needs, wants and desires of the bioregion, set of adjacent bioregions, or any given bioregion, with decreasing value given in that order. Gentler readers ought note that such of course constitutes the structure of the moneyless free labor societies, such is not coincidental, and that as such is defined via bioregions, as in ecological realities, such is also not arbitrary. In addition to this kind of understanding of waste, there is a more temporal understanding of waste, that is, waste that is defined via the durability, the quality of the goods and services being produced. Something is wasteful, in other words, insofar as the good or service wears out over time. Assuming that comparable labor and materials are used, and one good or service lasts for, 100 years, another 1,000, still another 1,000,000, and so on, those that last longer are less wasteful. This assumes that what is being produced is actually meeting the needs, wants and desires, that it is good, to use the likely relevant philosophical term. Creating something terrible that lasts longer is worse than creating something just as terrible but lasts a lesser length of time. A moneyless free labor society, it is argued, carries with it the proper incentives to create, to produce goods and services that are in fact good, not terrible, and which are in fact geared towards durability, hence, creating less waste. Taken together, these notions of limiting of waste entail a potentially rather powerfully applicable justification for the implementation of a moneyless free labor society, as, after all, such kinds of justifications are used by the defenders of the current moneyed system. The basic joint carving along the lines of bioregions and broader ecological grounds provides for the renewal of distinctive cultures relative to their bioregion as a matter of structure. In other words, it provides the basic framework within which cultural renewal and cultural diversification can occur. The primary, secondary, and tertiary trade relations structure provide for the relevant creation and production of goods and services required for renewal, diversification, and maintenance of differing cultures. The capacity to visit other places wherein the reality there is actually different is a good thing in general. To go to some place wherein people actually live differently, where they dress differently, their songs and dances are different, their foods are different, the ways in which they hold ceremonies, religious practices, faith practices, their sense of ethics, honor, duty, sexual practices, etc., are different. These are all fairly wonderful things. To be within a place, a stranger in a strange land, to feel the exoticism of the place carries with it some non-trivial degree of wonder, beauty, and intrigue. To be welcomed within such spaces is something of a requirement. The basic ethics of welcome to the traveler, the stranger, in other words, are good sorts of ethics. Much of these ethical considerations are expounded upon in The Odd Questions of Privilege, A Slight History of Colonialism, and also within The Rape of the Swan. Here I want to strongly suggest that the differentiations therein amount to the differentiations of aesthetical ethical considerations, rather than differentiations predicated upon obligatory ethical concerns. Among the more plausibly difficult aspects to grasp within that are the gendered relations, that is, the relations between the sexes, as these constitute a great deal of aesthetical ethical concerns, and indeed, a good deal of cultural realities at all. Understanding how these are oft, though not always, merely aesthetical ethical considerations is important for folks to grasp at from whatever culture. Being capable of maintaining these differentiations even though they are in point of fact merely aesthetically ethical sorts of differences, is important in virtue of exactly what is being described here, the renewal of cultures. Likewise, being able to establish and identify wherein we are not merely dealing with an aesthetical ethical difference, but rather an obligatory ethical differentiation, and understanding how mistaking the one for the other, aesthetically ethical for obligatory ethical, or obligatory ethical for merely aesthetically ethical, are among the key relevant cultural, philosophical, and practical sorts of distinctions to be had. Largely these distinctions are to be found in the aforementioned pieces, The Rape of the Swan and The Odd Questions of Privilege, A Slight History of Colonialism. In this regard, the Moneyless Free Labor Societies adds a highly relevant structural aspect as it relates to trade, economics and labor, upon which such relevant ethical considerations can be well-founded and established. In the current, folks can at least in part grasp at the relevance of the Moneyless Free Labor Societies piece to these questions, via the lessons of the blue jeans. As in, there is literally nothing wrong at all with blue jeans. They're good pants. But they everywhere, and insofar as they are everywhere, they muscle out other styles of clothing. The bioregional constraints in part mitigate the capacity for this problem, and it is a problem. Likewise, the elimination of monies structurally delimits the motivations for people to produce goods and services en masse. Absent these kinds of constraints, these structural scaffolding upon which trade can function, ultimately trade falters, diversities fail, and there are economic as well as significant cultural problems. The ending of a culture, after all, is no small thing to consider. Likewise, the increased capacity for folks to do in-home labor entails an increased capacity for the production of culture, as in, time to create and raise the little ones with some kind of cultural values taught in home, and capacity for people to create idiosyncratic crafts, goods and services, etc. The Moneyless Free Labor Societies also provides greater amounts of free time to build the social connections, beyond the mere acts of work by which such things as festivals, celebrations, holy days, good times, and so forth are crafted, without which these things simply tend to dry up. I feel it is worthwhile to denote that the renewal of cultures has a significant component as counterpoint to the effects of global colonialistic practices. There are meaningful differences in cultural practices that remain, but many of these kinds of things are under threat via especially the current economic structures. Bluntly, the renewal of cultures takes place via the bioregional constraints of trades. The prioritizing of locally produced goods and services, the restoration of resources, and the delimiting of economics to within the renewal rates of said resources. Moreover, and this one may be a bit of a jagged pill for some folks to swallow, but from a historical perspective, the renewal of cultures is made plausible via the eradication of the big bads within the older cultural expressions, the availability of goods and services via the spread of the seeds of plants and animals, and the capacity to meaningfully learn from other cultures in the current. Which, again, is novel for this species. An opportunity for folks to start afresh and renew. It's an unobvious boon, but a moneyless free labor society will tend to improve public discourse. Undercutting issues associated with concerns regarding political differences and monetary concerns, those rather divisive rhetorical and horrible kinds of talking points that serve mostly to infuriate. Beyond the basic aspects of removing and limiting these kinds of destructive discourses, however, there are the issues that surround discourse as a matter of competition. The belief that there are winners and losers involved in a conversation, or that the reality is about competition as such, each entail understanding that to speak to someone, or to do an action towards something, is to enact in a combative, competitive manner. Without holding too strongly to the point, as if there were no value in debate, discourse of differing ideas, etc. I think that, for instance, the history of philosophy does a fine job largely speaking for itself. The overarching structure of public and private discourses are divisive and fairly unproductive due to the notions associated with the beliefs and actions just alluded to. To quote the poets, who is the best, the East or the West? This is the crap our children are learning. Likewise, if it is the case that certain systemic problems are dealt with, to what exactly are the species' discourses going to be directed towards? If, in other words, the machinations of political power and money's illusory roles are removed, to what exactly are the discourses directed? If racism were solved, what would the discourses become? If the impetus to war, hatred, bigotry, etc. were removed, to what then would the discourses discuss? I assume, and I stress it's an assumption that the discourses would thereby become improved. The removal of much of the political BS, the machinations of rhetoricians, illusory power structures, concerns about handling the systemically poor, etc., entails the removal of a lot of what folks tend to talk about. I call this aspect a boon, though TBH I am uncertain as to if it is. But I do not think that the loss of those conversation pieces is too high a price to pay for the removal of the underpinning conditions of those pieces. I have, in private mostly, wondered significantly about this point. Conversations on these topics have been a significant part of my life, as they have for a lot of people. What happens when they're no longer required? Boredom, as alluded to throughout this piece, may become a thing, and hence too, may become a significant motivational feature to do things in such circumstances. I'm particularly uncertain, though, at what, if any, horror such silences on issues of injustices may entail. What happens when the cannons go silent? When the war and fear-mongers no longer mong? When the pensively pretentious needn't be? When the moneys move no more? When the last racist goes quietly? When bigotry becomes passé? What are conversations of kindness anyway? Partly, truly partly at the least I know the answers to that. I do. Do you? Are you familiar with them? Can you have them? It ought be uncanny to many, I think. How many haven't heard a kind word before? Or too few of them? How many waken and drift to sleep with unkind things? I scarcely recall the sound of kindness, TBH. Maybe I've been to war far too long. I do not trust the sound of kindness. It has a sound of hollowness to it. I recall the sound of laughter. I recall joyfulness, I do. But kindness? I am kindness. I am generosity. I am joyfulness. I am love and laughter. Where are you, though? Love it when you talk. Perhaps such is merely a matter of my personal dispositions towards addressing those things, such is a philosophical aim after all, of philosophy in general I mean. To what though to speak of in such circumstances? The ringing in my ears, a surprisingly harsh sort of proposition.
काम किया हो